All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Giandonato. Presently serve as a fitness training instructor for the World Instructor Training Schools. I've been affiliated with World Instructor Training Schools for the past decade, so since 2010, where I've taught a number of classes throughout the Philadelphia area and also within the New Jersey and New York markets. So I've had the opportunity of working with hundreds of alumni over the past decade or so. So it is an honor to be on the call with you guys today. We're going to be discussing a pretty hot topic that's quite relevant, especially as we have people that are transitioning back into facilities, returning following long layoffs. And certainly this is something that can be done at home with limited to no equipment, and also can be performed safely with some or minimal equipment. And that's really the utility of ultra high repetition training. So just a little bit about myself. If you haven't had an opportunity to join some of my previous webinars, last year I discussed the impact of COVID-19 and discussed exercise immunology, and also worked closely with one of my closest friends and colleagues, Mark Cassidy. He too has worked for World Instructor Training Schools for a number of years. When we discussed procedures to reopen and operate a facility amid COVID-19. So I've worked within the fitness industry for the past 15 years, in a number of capacities, facility director, within a campus recreation environment, also worked as strength and conditioning coach at the high school and collegiate level. I've supported a number of professional athletes, including NBA and also G League players leading up to the pandemic, ironically, and also have served as an adjunct professor of kinesiology and exercise science within the Philadelphia area. I've had the opportunity to write for a number of outlets, including World Instructor Training School. So for me, this is really a labor of love. This is a passion, helping, you guys, inculcating, some good ideas, discussing, some good ideas, because iron is sharpening iron, on this very call. So if there's anything that you want to add or suggest, and we will, open up a little bit of a discussion on the back end of the call. I want to say maybe around 4:30, 4:35 or so, once we get through some of our content and also some questions that were submitted to me on ultra high repetition training. Be more than happy to engage in a discussion with you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. So, this was the first question that I received, a couple days after having that article published earlier this year. So what, number range or what rep range constitutes ultra high repetition sets? And before we answer, that question, why don't we go ahead and, revisit a chart that we've probably seen, in some of the content thus far, or, maybe we've read this in magazines, maybe we've referenced, some of these, repetition ranges. So traditionally prescribed training volumes to elicit specific or desired adaptations, are as follows. So we have maximal or limit strength. So that's when we're talking about our 1 rep maximum and how we want to improve that. So it's going to be, 6 reps or fewer performed over the course of 2 to 6 sets. For muscular power, and muscular power is going to be representative of about 35 to about 55% of your 1 rep max. We're focusing on rate of force development in some of these, movements. So for instance, doing, a dynamic effort bench press, dynamic effort deadlift, or a squat, for instance, employing again that 35 to 55% of our 1 rep max. The repetition range is going to fall between 1 and 5, performing between 3 and 5 sets. For hypertrophy, we're looking at between 6 and 12 repetitions. That's kind of the sweet spot, so to speak, because it enables us to utilize anywhere from 70, roughly really 68% to 82% of our 1 rep max. And again, a lot of things, can impact, when we're doing percentage-based training, which we'll touch on a little bit today. But for hypertrophy, 3 to 6 sets is considered ideal, or really the sweet spot, so to speak. And then, of course, we have muscular endurance. So up to and beyond, really beyond 12 repetitions performed over the course of 2 or 3 sets is something that is, considered, quite textbook. So it is worth noting that training volume is inversely related to intensity, which means that the greater volume will necessitate a reduction in intensity as measured by percentage of an individual's 1 rep max, perceptive feedback, or data culled from graded exercise testing, such as a VO2 max, and also, lactate threshold, especially if we're, gathering, that data. So there are a lot of ways that we can quantify, whether collecting raw data or getting, some ratings of perceived exertion to measure, intensity or effort rather. So, conversely, when training volume is titrated down, when we're, diminishing volume, that's when the intensity, can be dialed up. So I don't know how, familiar you guys are with, the Menser brothers and Arthur Jones, who had founded, Nautilus. So a lot of the Nautilus equipment that you see, these days, and really not all that much. It's been phased out over the past, 10 or 15 years, but you do see some cardio pieces in some facilities. So the premise of this story is Arthur Jones had conducted this experiment called the Colorado experiment, where he had subjected, a few subjects, 2 being the Menser brothers and a couple of other bodybuilders, one being Casey Viator, to performing very high intensity exercise. So performing repetitions to failure on a given set, or maybe leaving, 1, repetition in the tank. And that over the course of time, demonstrated, increases in physiological cross-sectional area. Also, it demonstrated some increases in strength, and they were training, if you attach an RPE to that, probably 10 out of 10. So there are, more ways to skin a cat, so to speak. So you can obviously improve hypertrophy, you can improve strength, you can improve, muscular power, just by manipulating some of those variables. But do keep in mind that they were not able to train with high volume when you're training to failure, on every set. And they were doing, full body days, 2 to 3 days a week. And a lot of that training, was really kind of predicated upon, recovery. So they had, really 3 to 4 off days, per week, where they're engaging in almost full recovery. So that is something that is worth noting. One thing that I would like to point out, as it pertains to, some of these repetition ranges, and again, these are really references. When we move from that 1 repetition maximum, calculating training loads becomes trickier. For instance, who here is familiar with a 1 rep max calculator? You see them on exrx.net. There are a lot of other resources out there, Livestrong, Stack.com. I've authored articles, on how to calculate 1 rep max. But if you guys, may be familiar with the NFL Combine or the NBA Combine that'll be coming up shortly, is participants have to perform as many reps with 225 or 185, if you're in the NBA, as many reps as possible. Kevin Durant couldn't hit it once, by the way, but again, it's not really an indicator of how you're going to perform, as an athlete, because he had a monster night the other night against Milwaukee. But I digress. So, what happens for some of the outliers, guys that aren't Kevin Durant, but maybe, for instance, the Jake Longs and the Vernon Golstons of the world, or more recently, DK Metcalf putting up 27 repetitions, on a, 225 bench press. Well, if I was to enter that in a calculator, he'd have a 1 rep max of about 700 or 800 pounds. We know that's certainly not the case, because there aren't any 700 or 800 pound benchers in college football or the NFL. So again, the further we get away from 1 rep max, and now we're, focusing on muscular endurance, which is exactly what the 225 bench press test is, it's going to be pretty inaccurate. So do keep that in mind. That also applies with any given exercise, especially if we are applying some external loading to it. So there's really no correlation between maximal strength output and also muscular endurance, as I found through an exhaustive review of the literature, but also a lot of my experience over the past 15 years working with athletes, working with a couple of bodybuilders, and working with many clients over the years. So there's really no correlation between those at all. And a lot of that is really linked to varied energy system involvement. For instance, singular maximal strength output, that's going to be most dependent upon neural pathways. So we're talking about activation, synchronization, and also firing of those motor neurons, which are embedded within those muscle fibers. Or in the case of maximal speed or power output, selective recruitment of some of those higher threshold motor units that comprise, those type 2A muscle fibers that, we've learned about, within our, WITS course. Of course, it is worth noting that repeated bouts of maximal or circummaximal or near maximal strength, speed, or power output, we rely more heavily on readily usable ATP or adenosine triphosphate stores, which are supplied by the phosphagen, glycolytic, and also oxidative energy systems, in differing amounts in terms of quantity and also the cadence at which those supplies are replenished, or ATP supply is replenished. One thing that we also need to consider too, when we are talking about repetition ranges, and when we will visit some of the literature as it pertains to performing higher repetition training, is the role of rest periods, because they're intimately tied to adaptations. So longer rest periods, 3 to 5 minutes, are recommended for those that are engaging in maximal strength bouts. For instance, if you're below 6 repetitions, if you're performing those 2 to 6 sets, and again, these are guidelines, you're going to be employing rest between 3 to 5 minutes, and that actually will help reduce some of the psychological trauma or some of the stress that's associated with training, because again, you want to make sure that you are in a pretty even keel state when you are training for strength, because it is so technique specific. It's going to permit greater recovery, and that in turn is going to permit that greater external loads can be utilized, which thereby equate to more mechanical tension and also muscle damage. Shorter rest periods or negative rest, characterized by a disproportionate work to rest ratio or work to rest ratio of less than 1 to 1. For instance, if you're doing maybe 1 minute of work or time under tension, of a respective set is 1 minute. Keep the math simple here. And we're resting for 45 seconds, 30 seconds. That, leads to greater metabolic stress. It could potentially be catabolic or counterproductive. But, when we are incorporating, 1-to-1 work to rest ratios, or when we are doing some negative rest, that's going to lead to greater lactate production, because we're now in the glycolytic energy system for the most part, in terms of how that ATP is being produced, and obviously transferred to mechanical energy. So the good thing about that, when we are training with the 1-to-1 work to rest ratio, when we're doing minute sets, which are pretty popular within the bodybuilding culture, is that and a lot of times people in the trenches are ahead of the science because they're intuitive, they're experimenting. Bodybuilders have done that. They've kind of shaped the way that we've studied, strength training over the past, 50 or 60 years. So they're a little ahead of us, because when you train, when you're doing those minute sets, when you're, doing a little bit of negative rest, and I would utilize that judiciously, is that it's going to trigger, the secretion of these transcriptive proteins. So we have myogenin and also follistatin. And why these are important is because they block, have you guys ever heard of myostatin? Myostatin is an inhibitory, myokine, and that regulates, or that limits, muscular hypertrophy. So if you run myostatin, run a search in Google, you'll see, for instance, if you have animals that aren't secreting, sufficient myostatin, they're overgrown, they're overdeveloped, they have a lot of muscularity. So that's why a lot of bodybuilders, that's why people that are training for hypertrophy, they like to really focus on increasing that time under tension and also reducing the rest periods. And that's going to jack up your ventilatory threshold. That's also going to increase your muscular endurance and your anaerobic work capacity. But we want to make sure we're safe here. So when we are doing ultra high repetition training, especially with some compound exercises, it's probably best to go 1-to-1 work to rest ratio, to mitigate any sort of injury risk.
Hey, Joe, real
Yes,
quick,
Jay.
I got a question here.
Sure.
From Allison, any research used for the difference between males and females with these numbers?
Hi, Allison. Yes, we're going to dive into some of that research, as pertains to ultra, high repetition training. But everything that, we've presented, thus far in terms of, ideal rep ranges for strength, power, hypertrophy, and muscular endurance, these are, really, gold standards, if you will, for both males and females. It is worth noting that probably the most impact would be that person's training status. So maybe if they're a novice versus intermediate versus someone who might be an advanced athlete, that's where we're going to be incorporating some more exotic protocols and loading schemes. But really there are no differences.
No, that's great. Thank you. Also, I think as we go forward with this because we're really dealing with some trainers at different levels of intermediate, advanced, and so on, which makes it so valuable across the board. I would even suggest, if you could, also when you're going through them, is maybe even share, what a compound exercise is versus some of the other variables there. So.
Yeah, happily, and that's something that I'll tie into. I have another question that's embedded a little bit deeper in the slide to provide some practical solutions or some suggestions for us fellow fitness professionals and how to incorporate that. So we'll be touching on that, and also Allison, and for you guys on the call too, training status, but also hormonal status. Obviously, for instance, males, and those that might be delving into something that might be a little illicit, are going to be able to, tap into more testosterone, and that leads to a little bit more of, acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter at the neuromuscular junction. That's going to help, with strength and power output too. But really, it comes down to training, and then to a lesser extent, hormonal status. That's really going to dictate the adaptations associated, with training for strength, power, hypertrophy, and probably the one that's the least impacted by both, one's training status, because it's going to improve off the bat, and also hormonal status would be muscular endurance. But that's a great question, Allison. All right, so we're going to go ahead. We'll continue on. So what does the research, say about ultra high repetitions? So I, did a, extensive review, prior to, putting together, this article, and I had the great fortune of, having it published, on our website. It's something that I love doing. Again, a labor of love. I'm a research hound. That's how I go to sleep at night. That's my sleep aid, so to speak. So it's not melatonin. It's reading studies, like this before bed. I missed out on a terrible Sixers game by virtue of reading research last night. So happy about that. Go Sixers, I guess. All right. So, considerable improvements, were noted in both strength and also body composition among members of a cohort with strength training experience over a 12-week period. So we're looking at people that are advanced. We're looking at people that are intermediate, or they have some experience, with strength training. And they were performing repetitions of greater than 20 repetitions, per set. Among untrained individuals, there was a negligible difference, or negligible differences in strength were noted among groups who performed 3 to 5 repetitions. We talked about 3 to 5 repetitions kind of being the gold standard. Before, okay, if you want to improve strength, we want to go 6 repetitions or fewer. 13 to 15 repetitions, and then also 23 to 25 repetitions. And these individuals, they train 3 times weekly over a period of 7 weeks. Another untrained group performed 20 to 28 repetitions, per set over a period of 8 weeks, significantly improved their muscular endurance. So ultra high repetition training has, multiple, utilities and is effective throughout the continuum, of various, muscular fitness qualities ranging from strength all the way to muscular endurance. DEXA scans. So are you guys familiar with, DEXA scans? They're used to, evaluate bone mineral density. DEXA scans following a 27-week, protocol that involved low load, high repetition resistance training revealed significant improvements in pelvic, girdle, mineral density, and also accretions within the appendicular skeleton, so the arms, the legs, and also the lumbar spine. So performing higher repetitions could be beneficial for individuals that can't handle heavy loads, that might be arthritic, they might be older, they might have, some injuries or might have some adaptive needs. And they can certainly, benefit from that, as there's going to be, degradations in bone mass and also bone integrity, over the course of one's lifetime. There are age-associated decrements in, physiological, integrity and function. One thing that I'd also like to note too is that, performing repetitions to failure. So again, training to failure, just like, Mike and Ray Menser and Casey Viator were doing as part of that Colorado experiment conducted by Dr. Arthur Jones, founder of Nautilus, is, performing repetitions to failure at 30% of one's 1 rep max within an 8-week program evoked increases in physiological cross-sectional area. So we're talking about mass. Okay, so we're looking at, for instance, if they're doing maybe bicep curls, their arm mass, their upper arm mass, their elbow flexors, those muscles are going to get larger. So, they actually increased, in the lower thigh or the quadriceps, 7.8%, which was comparable to high load repetitions to failure, or 8.1%. So we can see that ultra high repetition training is maybe a little more efficient, maybe a little safer, because obviously we run the injury risk, or the injury risk is magnified when we increase the external load. So it's a viable alternative. And then also the other group, high load repetitions not taken to failure, improved, the physiological cross-sectional area, increased physiological cross-sectional area hypertrophy by 7.7%. So it's comparable to, training with heavy loads to failure, and also heavy loads not taken to failure. Comparable increases in muscular thickness were observed among groups of women who engaged in 30% of their 1 rep max, or 80% of their 1 rep max over a period of 6 weeks. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with, Brad Schoenfeld does a lot of research within, strength training, and also hypertrophy. He's worked with a lot of bodybuilders. He and a group of colleagues, including Brett Contreras, the glute guy, he's pretty, commercialized and a brilliant guy too, illustrated improved strength among highly trained subjects by performing a protocol of higher loads and moderate repetitions, 8 to 12 repetitions, but comparable increases in thickness of the elbow flexors and extensors, and also the knee extensors, were attained with lower loads and higher repetitions that range from 25 to 35 repetitions per set. And there were no alterations in terms of, participants or subjects' nutritional intake. So that's pretty interesting, where, you can still achieve, these gains in hypertrophy by employing, lower load, higher repetition, beyond 20 repetitions per set, training. And one takeaway here is that we can extrapolate from the research that high repetition training is effective in, or effective as, hypertrophic stimulus, really because of the repeated bouts of exertion over longer periods of time, so time under tension. And there are 3 drivers of hypertrophy. There's one that's mechanical tension. So that's really, you feel the mechanical tension when you're descending into a squat. or you're doing an RDL, especially during that eccentric phase, and you might have, a couple 100 pounds in your hands. You might be, doing a leg press just like, or a hack squat like the individual is in this laboratory setting. And, just say if they dialed up the resistance, you're going to feel that. That's the mechanical tension, that you're feeling at that point. And then there's also muscle damage, which is associated with repeated contractions. And then we have metabolic stress. What the research has shown is that, training with higher repetitions incurs, greater muscle damage and also greater amounts of metabolic stress, versus, higher load, lower repetition, exercises.
Oh, I got one for you here. Couple
Sure,
of
Jay.
questions actually.
Sure.
This is from Margaret. Staying mindful that a training session is usually an hour and knowing time is money to the client, while the body is at rest for 3 to 5 minutes for that particular muscle group, can other muscle groups be worked?
Hi, Margaret. That's a great question. So if we're speaking, I guess, in the context of, training for maximal strength, so if you have a client, for instance, and, maybe they're not a novice client, maybe they're an intermediate, maybe they're an advanced client. What I like to do, this is what I've done with athletes, this is what I've done, with strength athletes in particular, where, money was made in terms of, how much they were able to improve, their performance on a bench, on a squat, on a deadlift. I would utilize, that rest period. It would be, active rest. So they might be engaging in maybe some, low intensity, cardiovascular exercise, maybe some calisthenics. Maybe they would be doing some corrective exercise that were non-fatiguing. For instance, doing maybe some banded pull aparts, doing some, prone track raises, where they're doing, they're elevating their arm, within the scapular plane to activate, the lower trapezius muscle. And I would just throw, some of these examples out there. Maybe they perform, some stretches, but that's where we do a bevy of corrective exercises. Or what we would do too, so that way they are getting their money's worth, is they would be more so coaching intensive. So for instance, I would capture, on my phone, video. You could use, Coach's Eye. Darkfish has mobile applications. I might be breaking down, movements, or breaking down, portions of the repetition, so that way I could coach them up on, the subsequent, or something they could employ on the subsequent, set, or, maybe attempt, if you will. But I like to, dedicate that downtime, to teaching, or to incorporating, some exercises that are, a little less fatiguing, that are not going to, impede their ability to perform.
That's a great one. Great points in there. Stephanie has one for you. Is there research specifically looking at postmenopause women increasing bone mass after performing ultra high repetitions? And if yes, could you let us know exactly where to find the research paper?
Hi, Stephanie. So, there have been, some studies, that have demonstrated, increases in bone mineral density, particularly, in the fifth and also sixth decade, among all, populations, and I'd be happy to furnish that. I'll just have to, dig into, my files a little bit more deeply. But, there are a lot of, studies that do demonstrate, increases, in bone mineral density, because, any weight bearing exercise you're doing, walking, for instance, or if you're doing, some strength training, that is an ample osteogenic stimuli. So that is going to promote, some bone growth. I would probably, and just to put this out there, if you're, thinking about incorporating this for maybe some of your clients, is, if they're doing a lot of walking, if they're doing a lot of cardiovascular exercise, running, jogging, whatever the case may be, that might not be sufficient, for, the appendicular skeleton, the arms of the upper body, the spine, so to speak. So you might want to incorporate some strength training with them. And then also I'd be a little leery of doing exercises, that, involve bands only, and then also aquatic exercise. I discussed aquatic exercise earlier this year and its many benefits, but one of the drawbacks was it's not good, to build, bone mass. Of course, if you're not doing anything, aquatic exercise, will help, with the point nature of it's not going to, provide a robust osteogenic stimuli, or stimulus rather. That is a great question, Stephanie. So I'll see if I can cull some of those studies. And if you want to go ahead and provide, Jay, your contact information, I could send it over to you.
Nice, thanks.
Yeah, sure thing. All right. So, before we, get off this question, transition to, the next one, is that ultra high repetition training, has been established as, developing strength, increasing muscular hypertrophy or muscular size, especially because, again, we're looking at time under tension, and again, we're able to incur some muscle damage and also some more metabolic stress. And, that is known as mechanotransduction. And I'm going to geek out a little bit here. And I actually wrote on mechanotransduction. And interestingly, I had, authored a literature review on, stretching and how stretching, could impact, or how it could maybe contribute to, muscular hypertrophy, especially targeted stretching, that is. And again, I don't want to jump down a rabbit hole here and deviate too far from the topic, but mechanotransduction is a process in which those mechanical forces. So you're doing that shoulder press, for instance, and that's what I'm training tonight. So here we go, doing some bodyweight shoulder presses. All right, you're doing some shoulder presses. The mechanical forces that are associated with that load, acting on those muscles, and then the mechanical forces that your muscles, are generating to act upon, your levers or your limbs to hoist that, overhead, is going to prompt acute metabolic and also hormonal responses. And that is going to activate various signaling pathways. One being insulin-like growth factor 1. Insulin-like growth factor 1 inhibits myostatin. Okay, and we talked about those other transcript proteins that inhibit myostatin. In addition to that, too, mechanotransduction will also signal something known as mTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin. So mTOR, if you guys do some research on mTOR, you'll see that that is one pathway that a lot of researchers have spent time on in the past decade, in terms of wetting that to really reap some increases in muscular size or hypertrophy. One thing that I'd like to close on is, summarily, the intensity of effort. So it's the intensity of effort, whether you're, doing 30% of a 1 rep max, or 85 to 88, 87% of 1 rep max, you're able to maybe eke out, 2 repetitions. That is going to be the most closely correlated, with, respective aspects of muscular fitness. So if you're doing repetitions to failure and you're incorporating 30% of your 1 rep max, that's going to increase, muscular endurance. That's going to also increase hypertrophy. And maybe lesser trained populations, it's going to increase strength. The same thing if you're, now in the neighborhood of, 85 to 90% of a 1 rep max. Obviously, it's going to increase strength, but that's also going to increase hypertrophy too, but of the functional kind, the accretion of some of those muscle fibers, if you will, or myofibrillar hypertrophy. So that's one thing that we want to keep in mind, is the intensity of the effort. And that's something that you want to inculcate within your clients when you're coaching them, and this is what I like to do off the bat, even during a fitness assessment, is, okay, that's great that we could look at the VO2 max, we can look at a lactate threshold, we can look at heart rate reserve and VO2 reserve, we can look at all these cool things and fancy things, but if you don't have, the tools at your disposal, like the young lady has in the in the graphic here on the slide, is that you're not going to be able to accurately quantify intensity or training load. So my recommendation to you is, right off the bat, establish, framework, rating of perceived intensity, or, rating perceived exertion. That's something we discuss, within, the WITS course. So, 1 through 10, give them some examples, and then maybe you could, even subjectivize it to, where they are, what their pain threshold is, or pain tolerance or discomfort tolerance is. And then that way, you'll be able to gauge how hard they're working. And sometimes, what I'll do with, clients and athletes I've done in the past is, they might give me a number after a set. and I'll take that. And that's how we calculate training load. So it's really good to establish that common ground, and then you're able to evaluate, okay, this person's, really working, and that's going to help them achieve, their desired goal. So the next question is, yeah,
I got
Jay.
another question for you.
Sure.
Nancy was asking, how do you recommend integrating cardio before, after, or on other days?
Nancy, that's a great question. So, a couple of things, and we work in the fitness industry, and Jay can attest to this. Mark, if he's on the call, if we have other experienced fitness professionals, you can't give anyone like a yes or no answer. There are no absolutes here. Okay. So that's one thing that we'll take from the top. But as it pertains to balancing both cardiovascular exercise or aerobic training and also strength training or anaerobic training, it's really all going to come down to number one, goals, and then also number two would be time and logistics. Just say if some of your training goals, you want to be the strongest person possible in a 5 or 6 zip code radius. Okay, it's probably not going to behoove you to go out on a 3 to 5 mile run every day because of the potential interference effect. And when we talk about the interference effect is we have muscle fibers, these type 2 X muscle fibers, which are adaptable, which are malleable. And if you do a lot of endurance training, they take on some of the attributes of your type 1 or your oxidative muscle fibers. Or if you do a lot of strength training, now they're going to take on a lot of the attributes of some of those fast twitch glycolytic muscle fibers. So that's really number one to consider. Over the course of the week, if you're balancing this for maybe a general fitness client, from the perspective of both logistics and also behavior modification, why don't you just try to focus on doing something every day? So alternating, maybe some of your cardio, with some of your strength training. If we're in a gym setting and, we have a lot of clients, or we're working, with clients here, is okay, well, hey, I want to see you come to the gym every day, or I want to see you come to the gym 4 or 5 days out of the week. You're going to be meeting with me 2 or 3 days, but the balance of those days, and I'll check the register, in our CRM system, just come in, do some cardio, or, attest to that. Maybe, share with me, what you've done on Livestrong, Strava, and the Nike app. I like to incorporate, some sort of movement every day. But one thing that you need to do is you need to undulate the intensity of that movement too. Now, if we're doing, for instance, intra-session, cardiovascular exercise and resistance training exercise, this is really where you need to prioritize things. Okay, so let's talk about logistics. January 1st, first week of January, you're going to take what you can get. You have an open treadmill or even open squat rack, whatever's open to, just go right to it. All right. But just say things open up a little bit, you have more options at your disposal. You're training at home, or you're training in a smaller, niche, facility. You focus at that point on what are the fitness qualities that you want to address. What are some priorities? Is it going to be maximal strength? Is it going to be muscular power? Is it going to be muscular hypertrophy, muscular fitness, or is it going to be cardiorespiratory fitness? So those are some things that would need to be considered, because if you do maybe cardiovascular exercise first, now you're going to be running through your glycogen stores, so it's going to make things a little more challenging. You drink copious amounts of caffeine like I do in the morning to have a glycogen sparing effect, and that is demonstrated in the literature, but that is something that is worth considering, especially the time of day when person is training. So if they're training in the morning, and I never recommend doing any fasted exercise. It's not sustainable, number one. Number two, your blood glucose levels are very low. Your immediately tappable glycogen stores are also low too, especially upon waking up. Is maybe in the morning, doing some strength training, doing whatever is going to be a little bit more tolerable, and certainly not be getting that session maybe with some cardio, because your glycogen levels, and also your blood sugar might be a little bit lower earlier in the day, or depending upon your day as it progresses. But that is a great question. Again, can't give anyone like a yes or no answer. And you guys will probably find yourself in that same predicament too, or you run into someone from high school. Hey, I hear, your personal trainer, your strength and conditioning coach, are squats bad? I'm like, oh boy, all right. But that is a great question.
Well, I do have one more for you that's going back to one. I guess once it blocked out is, and this is from Susan, which is great. Is could he please answer question number one? What rep range constitutes high rep training?
Thank you for the question, Susan. I may have embedded in that long-winded answer or my preface. 20 repetitions or more would be considered, ultra high repetition, training.
Beautiful. Thanks.
Yep. Yeah, sure thing. And thank you so much, for your question, Susan, because I'm sure it helped a lot of people out because that was embedded in, some of my answers a little bit earlier. So I didn't really delineate it clearly, but anything beyond what would be considered, traditional in terms of training for, muscular endurance. And obviously you can improve muscular endurance, with ultra high repetition training as you can for hypertrophy. So what are some exercises that one should incorporate, or higher repetition ranges, and one that should really exclude them? So number one, any exercises where the goal is rate of force development. Okay, so if you're doing any sort of exercises that are performed ballistically, Olympic lifts, look to the girl in the picture on the right hand side after a failed, I don't know if it was a clean and jerk, I don't know if it was a snatch, which are two of the Olympic competition lifts. That's not something that you want to do to failure. There are certain training ideologies, that promote that. And it is, to me, it's harrowing. To me, it's appalling that they do so, just because you run the risk of, injuries, and those injuries can potentially be serious or even catastrophic depending upon the load and the way or the trajectory of the bar. So that's one thing to consider. I would not do any sort of, really overhead exercises, Olympic lifts, any ballistic exercises, to failure, or performing higher repetition sets, because we need to consider what is that exercise good for. When we're trainers, we have a toolbox, and we try to determine what tool is going to be optimal for that job. And if we want to improve muscular endurance, if we want to improve hypertrophy, we want to focus on time under tension. And you're not going to get a lot of time under tension when you're doing ballistic exercises. You're just going to be doing ballistic exercises, over and over and over and over again. I don't see, any pitchers who don't engage in strength training, that are, jacked. Now, granted, they're throwing, baseball, anywhere from 60 to 80, sometimes an upwards of 100 or 120 pitches, at the highest levels, at velocities over 80 or 90 or 100 miles per hour. But that's not going to be conducive to hypertrophy. So that's one thing that we need to consider. It's going to be time under tension, also accounting for the load too. So exercises that would not be appropriate, ballistic exercises, for instance, as I mentioned before, med ball throws or med ball exercises, which are great for power development, particularly rotational power, or multiplanar, power, Olympic lifts, any overhead lifts, any exercises that are compound exercises. So if you are doing, a squat, you're doing a bench press, make sure that you have, a spotter, a competent spotter nearby, and make sure that, the load isn't going to be, circa maximal, of course. And I also, I'm not a fan of doing, forced repetitions where, you see this in the gym all the time on International Bench Day every Monday, especially as these gyms are opening up. You'll have someone, hey, bro, can you give me a spot? And, I just need, help a little bit. All right, and they're doing a bench press. They get the hand off. The guy's hands are on the bar, and it's like a team bench press. One guy's doing a hybrid of an upright row and in a barbell row or RDL even, while the other guy is trying to press the barbell off his chest. So at no point do we want to do any forced repetitions, just because, they invite the risk of injury. They also tax the central nervous system too. So those are some things, worth considering. Bodyweight exercise are great to employ high repetitions or even training to failure. Same thing, doing some banded exercises because the tension isn't going to be all that great, there. And you're also going to be able to mitigate the risk of injury. My recommendation too is that if you are performing, higher repetition sets, do them maybe on the back end of the exercise or on the back end of the session, so that way you're freshest for exercises that are going to induce improvements in muscular strength or muscular power. So again, these are just some examples here. What I found too is that we don't need to lock ourselves in performing, high repetition sets all the time. Again, it's a tool in the toolbox. This is going to help people, bust through plateaus. In addition to that too, it's really good for, strength athletes that have lifted very heavy, to maybe scale things back, dial things back, do 30%, maybe, 25% of their estimated 1 rep max, and perform 20 repetitions that will address fitness qualities that they don't yet have developed, and also spare the joints, and spare the connective tissue that have undergone a lot of wear and tear of lifting really heavy stuff. So that's something that is worth baking into some programming considerations. So if anyone has any questions, just feel free to buzz Jay. We're going to move on to our final question that was sent to me, and one would be, and I alluded to it in the last answer, is how would a training program be structured to include ultra high repetition sets? And that answer again is dependent upon a person's goal, training history, injury history, to a lesser extent, one's hormonal status, logistics, for instance, maybe, equipment that they have, at their disposal. So every situation is going to be unique and different. But one thing that I can tell you is that, the ultra high repetition, sets, or performing 20 repetition sets or more, can be very helpful in promoting or facilitating recovery, number one. Number two, it's going to help people, break through, some plateaus, especially if they're, hanging out in more traditional rep ranges. Number three, it's also going to be, very good or potentially restorative to, some of the joints and the connective tissue. And it's a really good change of pace. You're also able to address, fitness qualities that were, otherwise, maybe neglected, by virtue of specialization or, training design. And if you are doing, ultra high repetition sets, alongside other, rep ranges within the course of a session, my recommendation is to do them, on the back end. And I would be, judicious in terms of, deciding when to train to, failure. I would not, try to do, heavily loaded compound exercise to failure if we are doing, ultra high repetition sets. Again, we want to mitigate injury risk. We don't want to do forced reps because of injury to both, the participant and also maybe the spotter. So those are some things, to definitely review. But if you're doing ultra high repetition training, we can do that in a block. We can do that in a phase. We can do that in a week. We can maybe, initiate, off-season training. That's something that I would do, with, high school and college football players that I worked with when I was, a strength and conditioning coach. Is after the season is over, you're not playing past Thanksgiving, might not be playing past Christmas. They have about a month off, maybe about a month and a half off. I'll just say, hey, be active, go down to, the training room, get some treatment, if you're on campus, if you're not on campus. These are just some things that I want you to do, or you can do just to keep active, keep loose, keep limber. But when we, reintroduce strength training, that's when we engage in, ultra high repetition training. because we needed to improve their work capacity. We needed to improve a constellation of fitness qualities that served as the foundation for what they were able to perform on the field. So that's really good, especially if it's early in the off-season period and you can dedicate maybe a microcycle 1 week or dedicate a full mesocycle or a cluster of weeks, within an annual, training plan.
That's good stuff, Joe. It definitely has
Thank you,
a
Jay.
lot of applications, and of course, it always shows across the board. You're gonna think through and earn your money as a trainer for what each individual client wants. Hence the title, personal trainer. How many times we see trainers in the gym doing some generic thing with somebody's father, and then a 20-year-old comes in and they do the same damn thing, and then a 32-year-old comes in female and they do the same damn thing, and you're going, they're not doing their job. They're not. And of course, those are the ones that don't stand out. And I guarantee you, always have been banging the drum when it comes time to it. And those 20 people are riding the bike or on the treadmills, and they are watching, they are listening, everything that they see from that trainer on the floor, whether it be just going over assessment testing with them for that month, which should be a regular thing for all of us, or exercises or whatever. They're picking up tidbits. They're watching, and the whole time they're going, my trainer doesn't do any of that or hardly any of that. I'm just getting some stuff that everybody seems to get or whatever. So I think I'm going to go talk to this guy when my little agreement's up with my trainer and see what this one can do for me, because those are the ones, just like you guys on here. We have a couple hundred people on here. You guys are taking notes, paying attention, going to get the recording afterwards to bone up a little bit more on the details. And that's the difference between the winners in the profession and climbing that ladder of success with clients, and of course even in the business itself. So this is great details. I know Joe's got a lot of them. They just flow out of him. He is full of research papers and experiences, which is
Not
really the big
though.
thing. So, so I mean, at the end, you're going to see his email. When you get the recording, it'll be there. So if you decide you want to ask a couple other stuff down the road after you think it through a little bit more, or come up with different situations for your clients, he loves teaching and sharing. So he'll be there for you. So keep going and doing what you're doing. We have added here some other suggestions on here. His paper is on there. Some of you were asking about the research papers and getting some more, and we'll definitely share that for you and get that over to the group as a whole as Joe digs up that one on the other aspect of a question from somebody, Allison, I think it was. But he has his blog that he wrote, which is very detailed and has his reference sources. At the end on ultra high repetition is on our blog, on our website, under the blog section, cleverly listed. And then, of course, here in the fitness store, there's other different things in there. Tony Thomas, for instance, did his programming concepts for personal trainers. It's a 3-hour webinar series broken up into 3 hours. Definitely worth getting some other ideas, concepts in working with your clients. And then, of course, these particular courses kind of expand on that, because I think a lot of times we we get stuck in a rut of what we're going to offer and how we're going to do it. And those variables, using body weight, bands, whatever, that variation is what keeps their brain power getting smarter and larger, and really motivating them to do what needs to be done, and more importantly, to respect a trainer who's going to be delivering that kind of information. Week in, month in, year out, guess who they think of, because you make it something that really lights up their world for that particular day, that particular week. So, keep learning. It's a ladder to climb. And here's Joe's information, but again, it'll be on the recording. But think about some things here and write them. It's a heck of a source to have, which I always appreciate our top team giving of themselves to share their emails so that they can respond if you have something of need. If not now, maybe 6 months down the road. comes up, and he may be able to give you some more guidance there. But keep learning, keep having fun. Joe, I appreciate what you did today. Everybody, the webinar recording will come out over the next 24 hours, and of course the quiz will be attached for everybody who was in attendance. And you have basically until Monday at 5 p.m. to fill it out and send it back in, and hopefully with a grade of 80 percentile or better, you'll get that extra free CEC. But you know, that's the plus, that's the bonus. But it's really just about getting the value of our colleagues here and sharing. So keep talking, keep learning. Joe, have a wonderful weekend. I appreciate what you do, my friend.
Hey, thank you for everyone's time and attention today. It was a true honor, joining everyone on the call. Feel free to reach out to me. Just capture a screenshot, and we will be in touch. All right, and Stephanie, be sure to reach out just to remind me, because I don't have your email address. Just shoot me an email. We'll correspond. I'll see what I'm able to dig up for you. All right.
Beautiful.
Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
Joe.
Have a good one.
Bye, everybody.